The ink blot on the contract seemed to grow larger with every passing second, and Sarah Mitchell could barely steady her hand enough to sign away the only thing she had left in this world: her father's ranch, all 2,000 acres of dusty Texas grassland that had been in her family since 1848. Her father had died 3 months ago, thrown from a spooked horse during a thunderstorm, and the debts he had hidden from her came crawling out of the woodwork like rattlesnakes from under a rock. The bank held the mortgage, past due by nearly 8 months. The feed suppliers wanted their money. The ranch hands had not been paid in 6 weeks. She was 23 years old, alone, and drowning in obligations she never knew existed. Her mother had passed when Sarah was just a girl of 9, leaving her to grow up learning to rope cattle and mend fences alongside her father, who taught her to be strong but never taught her about the mountain of debt he was accumulating. Now, in the spring of 1876, she sat in the dusty office of the Crossed Rivers Ranch, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, about to sign her life away to strangers. The man across from her, the foreman of Crossed Rivers, was a grizzled old fellow named Jack Thornton who looked at her with something between pity and impatience. Behind him, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was a younger man she had never seen before. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and some inches, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of a summer thunderstorm. He wore the typical garb of a working cowboy: dusty boots, worn denim pants, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a black hat hanging from the peg behind him. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, and there was a hardness to his jaw that spoke of a man who had seen his share of trouble. Her hands were shaking as she signed the papers, the pens scratching across the document that would transfer ownership of the Mitchell Ranch to Crossed Rivers. She felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of these men. She would not give them that satisfaction. The younger cowboy pushed off from the wall and stepped forward. His boots made soft thuds on the wooden floor as he approached the desk. Jack Thornton gathered up the papers, barely glancing at her as he shuffled them into order. But the young cowboy stopped beside her chair, and when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, with a warm Texas drawl that somehow eased the knot in her chest. "We will make this worth signing," he said, his storm-cloud eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I promise you that." She looked up at him, confused and still fighting tears. How could losing everything possibly be worth it? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, turning to face her properly. Jack Thornton had left the room with the signed documents, leaving them alone in the quiet office. Dust motes floated in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. "My name is James Hartley," he said, extending his hand. "I am the new operations manager here at Crossed Rivers, started 2 weeks ago." Sarah hesitated, then placed her small, work-roughened hand in his. His grip was firm but not crushing, warm and somehow reassuring. "Sarah Mitchell," she said, though he obviously already knew who she was. "Miss Mitchell, the deal we made with you includes more than just taking your land." Did Thornton explain the full terms? She shook her head, withdrawing her hand from his. "He said I had to sell or the bank would foreclose anyway, and at least this way I would get something instead of nothing." James's jaw tightened, and she saw a flash of anger in his eyes, though it did not seem directed at her. That old buzzard. He was supposed to explain everything. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Miss Mitchell, your ranch borders ours on the eastern side. The owner of Crossed Rivers, Mr. Garrett Thompson, wants that land to expand our summer grazing. But he is not in the business of throwing people out of their homes. The agreement includes several provisions that Thornton clearly did not mention." "What provisions?" She heard the suspicion in her own voice. In her experience, rich ranchers did not do favors out of the goodness of their hearts. "First, you receive a fair market payment for the land and all structures, which I believe is about $3,000. Second, You are offered a position here at Crossed Rivers as a horse trainer. Thornton mentioned you have a gift with horses, that your father bred some of the finest cutting horses in Texas. Sarah felt her heart skip. Her horses. She had assumed she would lose them all, that they would be absorbed into the Crossed Rivers herd and she would never see them again. What kind of position? Salaried. $60 a month plus room and board. You would have your own cabin on the property and you would be responsible for training our new horses and working with the difficult ones. We run about 300 head of horses here, and we are always bringing in new stock. We need someone who knows what they are doing. $60 a month was more than most cowboys made. Her father had paid his ranch hands $30 a month, and they had considered themselves lucky. Why would you pay me that much? James smiled, and it transformed his face from hard and serious to something altogether more appealing. Because good horse trainers are worth their weight in gold, and from what I have heard, you are better than good. Your father's horses have a reputation across 3 states. She wanted to believe him, but years of watching her father struggle had taught her caution. What is the catch? No catch. Mr. Thompson is a businessman, but he is a fair one. He does not want to be known as the man who threw Sarah Mitchell off her family land and left her with nothing. Bad for business, bad for reputation. This way, everybody wins. He gets the land he needs, you get a fair price and a good job, and your horses stay with someone who knows how to care for them. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. It was more than she had hoped for, certainly more than Jack Thornton had led her to believe. She had thought she would be signing away everything and walking away with barely enough to start over somewhere else, probably in some city where she knew nothing and no one. The idea of staying, of working with horses, of having a home still, it was almost too much to hope for. When would I start? She asked quietly. Whenever you are ready. We can have your things moved to one of the cabins by the end of the week. It is small, just 2 rooms and a porch, but it is clean and sound. You would take your meals in the main hall with the other hands, unless you prefer to cook for yourself. She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or mockery, but found neither. He seemed earnest, his gray eyes steady on hers. There was something else there too, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with business arrangements and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, like she mattered, like she was more than just a problem to be solved. All right, she said finally. I will do it, but I want it in writing, all of it. James nodded approvingly. Smart. I will have the papers drawn up today. You can read them over, and if everything looks good, we will make it official tomorrow. He stood, and she rose as well, feeling drained but also oddly hopeful for the first time in months. James walked her to the door of the office, and as she stepped out into the afternoon sun, he called after her. Miss Mitchell? She turned back, shading her eyes against the glare. I meant what I said. We will make this worth signing. You have my word on that. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and walked to where her horse was tied at the hitching post. As she rode back toward what was still, for a few more days, her family ranch, she found herself thinking not about the land she was losing, but about the man with the storm-cloud eyes who had made her a promise. And despite everything, despite all the reasons she had to be cynical and guarded, she found herself wanting to believe him. The next few days passed in a blur of packing and sorting. Sarah went through the ranch house room by room, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. The furniture was old and heavy, most of it built by her grandfather when he first established the ranch. She could not take it with her to a 2-room cabin, so she arranged for it to be sold in town. The money would help, even if it hurt to see her mother's rocking chair and her father's desk carted away by strangers. She kept only the essentials: her clothes, her father's pocket watch, her mother's Bible, a few photographs in tarnished silver frames, and her tack. Everything else could go. James had been true to his word, and the written contract arrived the next morning, delivered by a young cowboy who introduced himself as Tommy Rodriguez. He was perhaps 19, with an easy smile and respectful manners. Mr. Hartley sent me to help you move, miss, Tommy said, holding his hat in his hands. "Whenever you are ready, I have got a wagon and a couple of the boys to help load." Sarah read through the contract carefully. It was exactly as James had described, with no hidden clauses or traps that she could find. The payment for her land was fair, the salary generous, and there was even a provision that her personal horses, the 6 she had bred and trained herself, would remain her property, though they would be kept with the Crossed Rivers stock. She signed the second contract, this one for her employment, with a steadier hand than she had signed the first. Tommy witnessed her signature and tucked the paper into his vest pocket. "Welcome to Crossed Rivers, miss," he said with a grin. "You are going to like it there. Mr. Hartley is tough but fair, and the food is better than most outfits." Over the next 2 days, Tommy and 3 other ranch hands helped Sarah pack up her belongings and move them to Crossed Rivers. The cabin they gave her was on the eastern edge of the main compound, a small but sturdy structure built of pine logs and chinked with white plaster. It had a stone fireplace, a bedroom just large enough for a bed and a wardrobe, and a main room with a table, 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area. The porch faced east, and she could see the sun rising over the hills in the morning. It was not much, but it was hers, and after the fear of losing everything, it felt like a palace. James came by on her first evening to make sure she had everything she needed. He knocked on the door frame, though the door was open to let in the cool evening breeze. "Miss Mitchell, may I come in?" She turned from the fireplace where she was trying to coax a flame from stubborn kindling. "Of course, Mr. Hartley." He stepped inside, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe, and looked around the cabin. "Settling in all right?" "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been very kind." He moved to the fireplace and knelt beside her, examining her fire setup. Without a word, he rearranged the kindling, adding some small pieces of bark from his pocket and striking a match. The fire caught immediately, flames licking up and catching the larger pieces of wood. "Trick I learned from an old trail boss," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Dry bark catches faster than pine needles." "Thank you," she said, feeling somewhat foolish. She had built 1,000 fires in her life, but exhaustion and nerves had made her clumsy. James stood and brushed off his hands. "I wanted to talk to you about tomorrow. I thought I would show you around the operation, introduce you to the other hands, and then we can look at the horses. There are about a dozen that need work, mostly green broke or ones with bad habits that need correcting." "That sounds fine." He hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe. In the flickering firelight, his face was half in shadow, making him look both younger and more vulnerable than he had in the harsh light of the office. "I also wanted to say, I know this is not easy for you, losing your father, your home. If you need anything, or if anyone gives you trouble, you come find me. Understand?" There was a protectiveness in his voice that surprised her, a fierceness that made her pulse quicken. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, something raw and honest. "Because you deserve kindness," he said simply. "And because I know what it is like to lose everything and have to start over. I would have given anything for someone to offer me a hand up instead of kicking me while I was down." Before she could ask what he meant, he touched the brim of his hat and stepped out onto the porch. "Get some rest, Miss Mitchell. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." She watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, his tall frame silhouetted against the last light of the sunset, and felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising a hot day to come. Sarah dressed in her work clothes, a split riding skirt, a simple cotton blouse, and her scuffed boots, and braided her long brown hair down her back. She had not slept well. The unfamiliar sounds of the cabin and the knowledge that her old life was truly over keeping her awake long into the night. But she was used to functioning on little sleep, and she was not about to show weakness on her first day. James met her at the main barn just after sunrise. He already looked like he had been working for hours, his shirt dusty and his hat pushed back on his head. When he saw her approaching, he smiled, and she noticed for the first time that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow, a thin white line that gave his face character. "Morning, Miss Mitchell. Ready for the grand tour?" "As ready as I will ever be." He walked her through the main barn first, a massive structure that housed the ranch's prize horses and the tack for the entire operation. The smell of hay and leather and horse was comforting, familiar. She could hear horses moving in their stalls, the soft nickers and stamping of hooves. "We run about 300 head of horses," James explained as they walked down the center aisle. "Most are working stock, cutting horses, cow ponies, a few draft horses for heavy work, but Mr. Thompson also breeds horses for sale. That is where you come in. We need someone who can take the young stock and turn them into reliable mounts. We also have some older horses with problems that need fixing." He stopped at a stall where a young bay gelding watched them with nervous eyes, his ears flicking back and forth. "This is one of them. 3 years old, good bloodlines, but he is head-shy. Someone must have hit him because he panics if you reach for his face." Sarah approached the stall slowly, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. The bay snorted and backed into the corner, his eyes showing white. She did not try to reach for him, just stood there, breathing slowly and evenly, letting him get used to her presence. "He is scared," she said softly, "but there is intelligence there. He can be fixed." "That is what I was hoping you would say." They moved on, and James introduced her to the other hands as they worked. There was old Jack Thornton, who gave her a curt nod but did not apologize for misleading her about the terms of the sale. There was Tommy Rodriguez, who grinned and welcomed her again. There were the Miller brothers, Hank and Paul, burly men in their 30s who worked with the cattle. There was a quiet man named Samuel who managed the equipment and repairs, and a young woman named Lucy who worked in the kitchen. Lucy was perhaps Sarah's age, with red hair and freckles and a quick smile. "Nice to have another woman around," she said when James introduced them. "Gets lonesome being the only one. You should come have coffee with me sometime." "I would like that," Sarah said, meaning it. By mid-morning, James took her to the training corral, a large round pen with high fences where the young horses were worked. 6 horses stood in an adjacent paddock, all of them watching the humans with varying degrees of interest and suspicion. "These are your current projects," James said, leaning on the fence rail. "The bay you saw, a 3-year-old paint mare that bucks, 2 4-year-old geldings that were started but never finished, and 2 green 2-year-olds that have never been ridden. Take your time with them. I would rather have them done right than done fast." Sarah studied the horses, her practiced eye noting their conformation, their behavior, the way they interacted with each other. This was her element, what she had been born to do. "I will start with the bay," she said. "If I can win his trust, the others will be easier. Whatever you think is best, you are the expert." She glanced at him, surprised by the confidence in his voice. Her father had trusted her with the horses, but most men she had met thought a woman had no business training anything larger than a lap dog. "You really mean that?" It was not quite a question, but he answered anyway. "I do. I have been around horses my whole life, Miss Mitchell, and I know talent when I see it. Your father's horses were the best in Texas, and everyone says you were the one who trained them, not him. So yes, I mean it." Something warm unfurled in her chest, something that had been cold and tight for months. Respect. Trust. She had not realized how much she needed both until this moment. They spent the rest of the morning in the corral. James helped her separate the bay gelding from the others and move him into the round pen. She did not try to catch him or halter him, just let him move around the pen while she stood in the center, watching him, letting him get used to her presence. James sat on the fence rail, watching her work with an expression of focused attention. "What is his name?" she asked after a while. "Thunder. Not very original, I know." "Thunder," she repeated softly, and the bay's ears flicked toward her. "It is all right, Thunder. No one is going to hurt you here." By noon, she was exhausted. The work was not physically demanding yet, but the concentration required to read the horse's body language, to remain calm and patient, drained her. James seemed to sense it because he hopped down from the fence and opened the gate. "That is enough for today. Let us get some food." The mess hall was a long building with tables and benches where the ranch hands took their meals. Lucy and another woman were serving up plates of beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee. The food was simple but good, and Sarah realized she was ravenous. She had been too nervous to eat much breakfast. She sat at one of the tables, and to her surprise, James sat down beside her with his own plate. Several of the other hands joined them, and the conversation flowed easily around her. They talked about the cattle, about a fence that needed mending, about the weather. No one made her feel like an outsider, and when Tommy asked her opinion about a horse he was thinking of buying, the others listened to her answer with genuine interest. After lunch, James walked her back to her cabin. The afternoon heat was building and the air shimmered over the dusty ground. "You did good work this morning," he said as they walked. "That bay was calmer by the time you finished than I have ever seen him." "He just needs time and patience," she said. "Someone hurt him, and he needs to learn that not all humans are like that." James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "That is true for people too, I think. Sometimes we get hurt and we build walls, and it takes someone patient to help us learn to trust again." She glanced at him, wondering if he was talking about himself or about her. Maybe both. Before she could ask, they reached her cabin, and he touched his hat brim in that gesture she was starting to recognize as his way of saying goodbye. "Rest up this afternoon. It is too hot to work. Tomorrow we will start early before the heat gets too bad." As he walked away, Sarah stood on her porch and watched him go, feeling the strangest sensation that her life had just shifted in a direction she had not expected, towards something she could not quite name but that felt, for the first time in months, like possibility. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Sarah woke before dawn, worked with the horses in the relative cool of the morning, rested during the hottest part of the afternoon, and then worked again in the evening. Thunder, the head-shy bay, slowly began to trust her. By the end of the first week, he would let her approach him in the pen without panicking. By the end of the second week, she could touch his shoulder, his neck. By the middle of the third week, she could run her hand over his face, and he would lean into her touch instead of pulling away. James was there almost every day, watching her work or helping when she needed an extra pair of hands. He was good with the horses too, she noticed, firm but never harsh, reading their moods and responding accordingly. They fell into an easy partnership, working together without needing to talk much, developing the kind of silent communication that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. But there were other moments too, moments that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the way her heart would speed up when he smiled at her, or the way his hand would linger on hers when he handed her a lead rope, or the way he seemed to find excuses to seek her out even when there was no work reason to do so. One evening in early June, about a month after she had arrived at Crossed Rivers, she was sitting on her porch watching the sunset when James rode up on his big sorrel gelding. He dismounted and tied the horse to her porch rail, then climbed the steps and leaned against the post, looking out at the same view she was watching. "Mind if I sit a spell?" he asked. "Not at all." He settled onto the porch steps, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to orange to deep purple. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. "Anything. That first day in the office you said you knew what it was like to lose everything. What did you mean?" James was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he sighed and turned to look at her, his storm-cloud eyes serious in the fading light. "I grew up in Missouri," he began. "My father had a farm, nothing big, but it was ours. I had a younger sister, name of Emma, and a mother who made the best apple pie in 3 counties. I was 20 years old when the war ended, too young to have fought but old enough to remember what it did to people. He paused, and she waited, sensing this was a story he did not tell often. In '68, when I was 22, a group of men came through our county. They called themselves tax collectors, but they were really just thieves hiding behind official papers. They said my father owed back taxes, said we had to pay or they would take the farm. My father did not have the money. We had barely scraped by since the war ended. They gave us 3 days to come up with it, and when we could not, they burned us out. Sarah felt her chest tighten. They burned your home, burned the house, the barn, killed most of the livestock. My mother died trying to save some of her things from the house. Smoke got her lungs. Emma and I got out, and my father, but my mother— His voice cracked and he stopped, staring out at the darkening horizon. Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort. He covered her hand with his, holding it there. My father died 6 months later. I think his heart just gave up. Emma went to live with our aunt in St. Louis, and I headed west. I worked on ranches in Kansas, Colorado, finally ended up here in Texas 3 years ago. I have worked for 5 different outfits, saved every penny I could, learning everything I could about running a ranch. When Mr. Thompson offered me the operations manager position, it felt like maybe I was finally getting somewhere, like maybe I could build something again. I am sorry, Sarah said softly. I am so sorry that happened to you. He turned his head to look at her, and in the twilight his face was shadowed and beautiful and sad. I am sorry it happened to you too, losing your father, your home, but I meant what I said that first day. I am going to make sure this is worth it for you. You are going to have a life here, a good life. I am going to see to it. Why? She whispered. Why do you care so much? He stood up, still holding her hand, and gently pulled her to her feet so they were standing face to face on the porch. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, and she had to tilt her head back to look at him. The last light of the day caught in his eyes, making them glow like silver. Because from the moment I saw you sitting in that office, trying so hard not to cry, so determined to be brave, I felt something I had not felt in 8 years. I felt like maybe there was a reason I survived when my parents did not. Maybe it was so I could be here now to help you. He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. To what? She breathed. To fall in love with you, he said simply. I know it is too soon. I know you have been through too much, and I have no right to burden you with my feelings. But you ask me why I care, and that is the truth. I care because I am halfway in love with you already, Sarah Mitchell, and I cannot seem to help myself. She stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. It was too soon. She barely knew him. She was not ready for this. But underneath all those thoughts was a deeper truth, one she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She felt it too. The connection, the pull, the way her whole day felt brighter when he was near and dimmer when he was not. James, she said, and her voice shook. I do not know if I know how to do this. I never thought much about love before. There was always so much work to do, and then my father got sick, and then everything fell apart. I do not know if I have anything to give you right now. He raised his hand and cupped her cheek, his palm warm and rough against her skin. I am not asking you to give me anything. I'm just asking you to let me care about you. Let me be your friend, your partner in this work we are doing. And if someday you find that you care about me too, well, that would be the finest thing I could imagine. But there is no rush, Sarah, no pressure. I just wanted you to know how I felt. She turned her face into his palm, closing her eyes, feeling the warmth of him, the steadiness. And in that moment, she made a decision. She was tired of being afraid, tired of walls and caution and holding herself apart from anything good because she was scared it would be taken away. Maybe James was right. Maybe this was why they had both survived their losses to find each other. I think I am falling in love with you too, she whispered. And it terrifies me. She felt him go very still, and then he leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she did not pull away. She lifted her face to his, and when his lips met hers, gentle and questioning, she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and fear and hope that had been building in her chest for weeks. The kiss was soft at first, almost tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking something fragile and precious. But then his arm came around her waist, pulling her closer, and she rose on her toes, wrapping her arms around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I was so afraid you would tell me to leave and never come back," he said. "I thought about it for half a second," she admitted, and he laughed again, the sound rumbling through his chest. They stood there on her porch, wrapped in each other's arms, while the stars came out overhead and the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night drifted around them. Sarah felt something inside her unclench, some tight knot of fear and grief finally beginning to loosen. She was not healed yet, grief did not work that way, but she was beginning to believe that she might be someday. And that someday she might be happy again. Over the next several weeks, Sarah and James grew closer in ways both obvious and subtle. They still worked together with the horses every day, but now there was an easy affection between them, a closeness that showed in small gestures. His hand on the small of her back as they walked. Her fingers brushing his when she handed him a bridle. The way they sought each other out at mealtimes, always sitting together, their knees touching under the table. The other ranch hands noticed, of course, but no one seemed to mind. If anything, they seemed pleased, especially Tommy, who grinned like a fool whenever he saw them together. "About time Mr. Hartley found himself a good woman," he said to Sarah one day while they were cleaning tack together. "He has been alone too long, always working, never smiling much." "You are good for him." "He is good for me too," Sarah admitted, and it was true. James made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since before her father died. He made her laugh, which she had thought she might never do again. And when the grief hit her unexpectedly, as it sometimes did, he was there to hold her and let her cry and never make her feel weak for it. In late July, a big cattle sale was planned in town, and Mr. Thompson decided to send some of the trained horses along to sell as well. Sarah had been working with 6 horses intensively, and all of them were now reliable mounts, ready for new owners. Thompson asked her to come along to town to show the horses to potential buyers, and James, as operations manager, would be there as well. The town of Redemption Creek was about 15 miles from the ranch, a bustling little place with a main street, a hotel, several saloons, a general store, and a bank. The cattle sale was a big event, drawing ranchers and buyers from across the region. The Crossed Rivers contingent arrived early in the morning, driving the cattle and horses, and set up in the large corral area on the edge of town. Sarah wore one of her better dresses, a dark green cotton that her father had bought her 2 Christmases ago. She had put her hair up in a more ladylike style, and when James saw her, his eyes went wide. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "I clean up all right when I try," she said lightly, but she was pleased. The day was long and hot, and Sarah demonstrated the horses for what felt like 100 different potential buyers. She rode each one, showing off their training, their responsiveness, their calm temperaments. By late afternoon, all 6 horses had been sold for prices that made Mr. Thompson beam with satisfaction. "You have a gift, Miss Mitchell," he said, shaking her hand. Thompson was a big man in his 50s with a neat beard and sharp eyes. This was the first time Sarah had met him in person, as he had been away on business when she arrived at the ranch. "Those horses sold for nearly double what I expected. I am glad to have you on my operation." "Thank you, sir. I am glad to be there." As the sun began to set, James found her near the corrals. "How would you feel about staying in town tonight? There is a dance at the hotel, and I thought maybe you would like to go with me, if you want." The hopeful, almost boyish expression on his face made her heart melt. "I would love to," she said. They took rooms at the hotel, separate rooms because propriety still mattered, even on the frontier. Sarah freshened up and changed into her green dress again, taking more care with her appearance than she had in years. When she came down to the lobby, James was waiting for her, and he had cleaned up as well, wearing dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie. He had shaved and combed his hair, and he looked impossibly handsome. "You are going to be the most beautiful woman there," he said, offering her his arm. "And you are biased," she replied, but she took his arm and let him escort her to the hotel's large common room, which had been cleared for dancing. A small group of musicians were playing fiddle and guitar, and the room was already crowded with couples. James led her onto the floor, and they began to dance. Sarah had not danced since she was a girl, but James was a good lead, guiding her through the steps with easy confidence. They danced 3 songs in a row and then stepped outside for some air. The night was warm but pleasant, with a breeze that carried the scent of dust and horses and the distant smell of rain. They walked down the main street, which was quieter now that the business of the day was done. Most people were either at the dance or in the saloons. "I have been thinking," James said as they walked, "about the future, about what I want." "And what do you want?" Sarah asked, though her heart already knew the answer. He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "I want you. I want a life with you. I know it has only been a few months, but Sarah, I have never been more sure of anything. I love you. I want to marry you, build a life together, maybe have a place of our own someday. I want to wake up next to you every morning and work beside you every day and fall asleep holding you every night." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "James Hartley, are you proposing to me in the middle of a dusty street?" He grinned, that wonderful boyish grin that made him look younger and carefree. "I suppose I am. I know I should have planned something more romantic, maybe waited until I had a ring, but I could not wait. I love you, Sarah. Will you marry me?" She laughed, a sound of pure joy that bubbled up from deep inside her. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He whooped, a loud sound that echoed down the street and made a few people stick their heads out of the saloon to see what the commotion was. Then he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Redemption Creek. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the ranch hands from Crossed Rivers, a few people from town, and Mr. Thompson, who gave Sarah away since she had no family left. Lucy stood up as her maid of honor, and Tommy was James's best man. Sarah wore a dress that Lucy helped her make, a simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. James wore his best suit, looking nervous and happy and so handsome that Sarah could barely believe he was going to be her husband. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the hotel with food and music and dancing. Sarah had never been happier in her life. That night, in the hotel room that was now theirs as a married couple, James held her close and whispered promises against her skin, promises of love and loyalty, of partnership and passion, of a future they would build together. And Sarah, who had thought she had lost everything, realized that she had found something far more valuable. She had found home not in a place but in a person. When they returned to Crossed Rivers as husband and wife, Mr. Thompson had a surprise for them. He had built a small house on the property, a wedding gift, he said. It was larger than the cabin Sarah had been living in, with a proper bedroom, a kitchen, a sitting room, and even a small porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It was furnished simply but comfortably, and there was a garden plot already dug beside the house. "Every married couple needs a proper home," Thompson said gruffly, clearly embarrassed by his own generosity. "You both work hard for this ranch, least I can do." Sarah hugged him impulsively, surprising them both. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. James continued his work as operations manager, overseeing the daily running of the ranch, while Sarah focused on the horses. But they made time for each other as well, lingering over breakfast in the mornings, taking evening rides together across the rangeland, sitting on their porch at night and talking about everything and nothing. Sarah introduced James to some of her favorite techniques for working with difficult horses, and he showed her the account books and explained how the business side of the ranch operated. They were partners in every sense of the word, each respecting the other's knowledge and skills. In the fall, Sarah's mare, a beautiful chestnut she had bred herself, gave birth to a colt with perfect conformation and her dam's intelligent eyes. Sarah named him Promise because he represented the promise of the future she and James were building together. James spent hours with her in the barn, watching the colt learn to stand, to nurse, to explore his world on gangly legs. "He is going to be something special," James said, stroking the colt's fuzzy mane. "Just like his mother." "Just like his trainer," Sarah corrected, leaning into her husband's side. Winter came, and with it the slower pace of ranch life. The cattle were brought down from the high pastures and the horses were given lighter work. Sarah and James spent more time in their little house, making plans for the coming year. James wanted to expand the horse breeding program, and Sarah wanted to start taking on outside training clients, people who would bring their problem horses to crossed rivers for her to work with. Mr. Thompson agreed to both ideas, especially when James showed him the numbers and demonstrated how much money Sarah's training skills could bring in. By the time spring came around again, they had built a second training corral and put out word that they were taking clients. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, they had a waiting list of horses needing training, and Sarah had to hire Tommy to help her. She taught him her techniques, and he proved to be an apt student with a natural feel for horses. Together, they worked through the list, transforming fractious, scared, or poorly trained horses into willing, reliable partners. James was immensely proud of her, and he made sure everyone knew it. When ranchers came to pick up their horses and praised Sarah's work, James would stand beside her, his hand on her back, his pride evident in every line of his body. And when Sarah had a bad day, when a horse proved more difficult than expected, or when she was just tired and frustrated, James was there with encouragement and support, never doubting her ability. In the summer of 1877, just over a year after they married, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening on their porch watching the sunset as had become their habit. She was nervous, unsure how he would react. They had not planned for children so soon, though they had talked about wanting them someday. "James, I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his storm-cloud eyes immediately concerned. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine. More than fine, I am, we are." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her and she could not read his expression. Then a slow, wondering smile spread across his face, transforming him. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby," she nodded, her own smile breaking through. "In about 7 months, I think. Late January or early February." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt his shoulders shake. When he pulled back, there were tears on his face. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Sarah, I cannot believe this is the best news, the absolute best news." They spent the evening talking about the future, about names and whether it would be a boy or girl and how they would need to add on to the house to make a nursery. James was so excited he could barely sit still, and Sarah felt her earlier nervousness evaporate in the face of his joy. The pregnancy was difficult at times. Sarah was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. James fussed over her constantly, bringing her dry toast and weak tea, sitting with her when she felt too ill to work. Lucy came by almost every day to help, and the two women grew close as Lucy shared stories from her own mother's pregnancies and offered advice. By the time Sarah started to show, it was autumn again, and the work on the ranch was slowing for the winter. James insisted she take it easy, though Sarah argued that she was perfectly capable of working. They compromised. She would work with the horses in the mornings when she felt best, but only from the ground, no riding. James or Tommy would do any work that required being on horseback. As winter set in and Sarah's belly grew round with their child, James became even more attentive. He built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it for hours until there was not a single rough edge. He added on to their house, creating a small nursery next to their bedroom. He stocked the house with extra firewood and supplies, worried about being caught unprepared if the baby came during a snowstorm. On a cold night in late January 1878, Sarah's pains started. Lucy and the town doctor were sent for, and James paced the small sitting room like a caged animal while Lucy and the doctor attended to Sarah in the bedroom. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. James could hear Sarah crying out, and it took everything in him not to burst through the door. Tommy and some of the other hands sat with him, trying to distract him with card games and conversation, but nothing helped. Finally, in the early afternoon, he heard a new sound, a thin, wailing cry that made his heart stop and then race. Lucy opened the door, beaming. "You have a son, Mr. Hartley, a fine, healthy son, and your wife is tired but well." James pushed past her into the room. Sarah was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion, but smiling. And in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. James approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a fuzz of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. As James watched, the baby opened his eyes, storm cloud gray, just like his father's, and seemed to look right at him. "He is perfect," James breathed. "Sarah, he is absolutely perfect." "Do you want to hold him?" Sarah asked, her voice tired but happy. James sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Sarah placed the baby in his arms. He had never held anything so small, so fragile, and he was terrified he would do it wrong. But the baby settled against his chest, his crying quieting, and James felt something shift in his soul, an overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness so strong it almost brought him to his knees. "Hello, son," he whispered. "I am your father, and I promise you, I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life. You and your mother, you are my whole world now." Sarah reached out and took his hand, tears streaming down her face. What should we name him? They had discussed names but had not decided. Now, looking at his son, James knew. "Daniel," he said, "after my father, Daniel James Hartley." "Daniel," Sarah repeated softly, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, little Daniel." The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, and the overwhelming, all-consuming love that came with parenthood. James had never worked so hard in his life, managing his responsibilities on the ranch while also helping Sarah care for Daniel. But he would not have traded it for anything. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubbornness. He grew quickly, and by the time spring came, he was smiling and laughing and beginning to take notice of the world around him. Sarah carried him in a sling while she worked with the horses, and Daniel seemed fascinated by the animals, his little hands reaching out to touch their soft noses. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that revolved around their growing family. James and Sarah worked side by side as they always had, but now with Daniel as a constant presence. The ranch hands doted on the baby, and it was not uncommon to find Tommy or one of the other men walking around with Daniel in their arms, cooing nonsense at him while his parents worked. In the summer of 1878, James and Sarah celebrated their second anniversary. They left Daniel with Lucy for the evening and rode out to a secluded spot on the ranch land, a place where a small creek ran through a grove of cottonwood trees. They spread a blanket and shared a simple meal, watching the sun set just as they had on the porch of her cabin the first time he told her he loved her. "You ever regret it?" James asked as they lay on the blanket, Sarah's head resting on his shoulder. "Signing those papers, giving up your family ranch, ending up here?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. So much had changed since that day in the office when her hands had been shaking and her future had seemed so bleak. She had lost her home, but she had gained so much more. "No," she said finally. "I do not regret it at all. You told me you would make it worth signing, and you did. You gave me a home, a purpose, a family. You gave me everything I did not even know I needed." James tightened his arm around her. "You gave me those things too. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, working, saving money, but not really living. You taught me how to live again, Sarah. You and Daniel, you are my reason for everything." They made love under the stars that night, slow and tender, reaffirming their commitment to each other. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future. James wanted more children, and Sarah did too. They talked about expanding their horse operation even more, maybe even buying their own ranch someday, something they could pass on to Daniel and whatever other children they had. As they rode back to the ranch house in the moonlight, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had thought she was losing everything when she signed those papers, but instead, she had been signing the beginning of a new chapter, one that had brought her more love and happiness than she had ever imagined possible. Over the next several years, their life continued to grow and flourish. In 1880, Sarah gave birth to a daughter whom they named Emma, after James's sister. Emma was a quiet baby with dark curls and her mother's brown eyes, and she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. Daniel, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, from fetching diapers to singing her lullabies in his sweet, off-key voice. The horse training business thrived, and Sarah's reputation spread far beyond the immediate area. People brought horses from across Texas and even from neighboring states for her to work with. James had to build a third training corral and hire 2 more men to help manage the volume of work. In 1882, when Daniel was 4 and Emma was 2, Mr. Thompson approached James with an offer. He was getting older and wanted to retire, and he offered to sell Crossed Rivers to James. The price was fair, more than fair actually, as Thompson had grown fond of James and Sarah and wanted to see the ranch remain in good hands. It took every penny of savings they had, plus a loan from the bank. But in the fall of 1882, James and Sarah became the owners of Crossed Rivers Ranch. It was a dream James had held since he was a young man watching his own family's farm burn, and Sarah had never imagined she would own a ranch again, let alone one as large and prosperous as this. They worked harder than ever, pouring everything they had into making the ranch successful. Sarah continued training horses while also managing the books, and James oversaw the cattle operation and the day-to-day running of the ranch. They hired good people, treated them fairly, and the ranch prospered under their ownership. In 1884, Sarah gave birth to twin boys, Joseph and Jacob, red-faced and loud and constantly getting into mischief. Daniel, now 6, took his role as big brother seriously, helping to watch the twins and Emma, who at 4 was already showing signs of her mother's way with horses. The house had to be expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and James added on an entire second story, creating bedrooms for all the children and even a small office for Sarah where she could work on the books and manage the training schedules. Life was not without its challenges. There were years when the rain did not come and the grass dried up, forcing them to buy extra feed for the cattle. There were years when cattle prices dropped and they struggled to make ends meet. There was the year when Daniel broke his arm falling from a horse and scared his parents half to death. There was the year when a wildfire swept through the northern part of the ranch, destroying fencing and outbuildings, and nearly reaching the main house before the wind changed direction. But through it all, James and Sarah faced every challenge together, their love and partnership growing stronger with each passing year. They had built something lasting, something real, not just a ranch but a legacy. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, James and Sarah would sit on the porch of their house, just as they had done from the very beginning. Sometimes they talked about the day's events, about problems that needed solving or plans for the future. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. One evening in the summer of 1889, Sarah sat on the porch steps watching the sunset, just as she had so many times before. Daniel was 13 now, already taller than his mother and showing signs of becoming as tall as his father. He was working in the barn with Tommy, learning to repair tack. Emma was 11, a skilled rider who helped her mother with the training horses. The twins, Joseph and Jacob, were 5 and inseparable, always together, always scheming some new adventure. James came out of the house and sat beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sky turn gold and orange. "You remember that first day?" James asked. "When you signed the papers and I promised to make it worth signing," Sarah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I remember thinking you were either crazy or lying. I could not imagine how losing everything could possibly be worth anything. And now." She turned to look at him, this man who had become her whole world, who had kept every promise he had ever made to her. His dark hair was starting to show threads of silver, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but to her, he was just as handsome as the day they met. "Now I know you were telling the truth," she said softly. "You did make it worth signing. You gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You gave me love, family, purpose, a home. You gave me everything, James." He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "You gave me everything, too. You took a broken man who had lost his way and you gave him a reason to hope again, to dream again, to love again. I thank God every day that you walked into that office, even though I know it was one of the worst days of your life, because it led you to me. And me to you," she whispered. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that spoke of years of love and partnership and a future that stretched out before them, full of promise. When they pulled apart, Sarah rested her head on his shoulder again, and they watched the sun disappear below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and purple. Inside the house, she could hear the children's voices, Daniel calling to Emma about something, the twins' laughter as they chased each other through the rooms. These were the sounds of the life they had built together, the life that had started with shaking hands and a signature on a contract and a cowboy's promise to make it all worthwhile, and he had. Oh, how he had! The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Daniel grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's gift for horses. When he turned 18 in 1896, he began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sweet-natured girl named Catherine who loved horses almost as much as Daniel did. They married when Daniel was 20, and Catherine came to live at Crossed Rivers, becoming like a daughter to James and Sarah. Emma, spirited and independent, announced at 16 that she wanted to go to college back east to study veterinary medicine. James and Sarah supported her decision, though it broke their hearts a little to see her leave. She wrote home faithfully, and her letters were full of enthusiasm for her studies. She came home every summer, and eventually, after earning her degree, she returned to Texas permanently, becoming one of the first female veterinarians in the state. She set up practice in Redemption Creek, and Crossed Rivers became one of her primary clients. The twins, Joseph and Jacob, were as different as two people could be despite being identical in appearance. Joseph loved the cattle operation, spending every spare moment with the cowhands, learning everything he could about ranching. Jacob, on the other hand, had a head for numbers and business. By the time they were 15, Jacob was helping Sarah with the books and had reorganized their entire accounting system, making the ranch more efficient and profitable. In 1898, Daniel and Catherine gave James and Sarah their first grandchild, a boy they named James after his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, James felt the same overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness he had felt when he first held Daniel. Sarah stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, marveling at the tiny life they had helped bring into the world. More grandchildren followed over the years. Emma married a veterinarian colleague and had 2 daughters. Joseph married a schoolteacher from town and had 3 children. Jacob married a girl he had met in San Antonio and had 2 sons. The house on Crossed Rivers was always full of children's laughter and chaos, and James and Sarah loved every minute of it. As the new century dawned, James and Sarah found themselves in their mid-40s, surrounded by the family and life they had built together. Crossed Rivers Ranch was one of the most successful operations in Texas, known for its quality cattle and especially for its horses. Sarah's training methods had been written about in agricultural journals, and people came from across the country to learn from her. But despite all their success and the busyness of their lives, James and Sarah always made time for each other. They still took evening rides together when they could, still sat on their porch watching the sunsets, still held hands like newlyweds whenever they walked together. One evening in the summer of 1905, they rode out to the place where they had celebrated their 2nd anniversary, the grove of cottonwood trees by the creek. They were older now, both of them showing the marks of years of hard work and Texas sun, but to each other they were still the young people who had fallen in love nearly 30 years ago. They sat on a blanket by the creek, watching the water flow past, silver in the moonlight. Sarah was quiet and James could tell she was thinking about something serious. "What is on your mind?" he asked, taking her hand. "I was thinking about my father," she said softly. "About how much debt he had, how close I came to losing everything, and I realized something tonight." "What is that?" "He did not lose everything. Even though the ranch was gone, even though he died thinking he had failed, he did not fail. Because he raised me to be strong, to work hard, to never give up. And those things led me to you and to this life and to our children and grandchildren. His legacy did not end when he died or when I signed those papers. It continued through me, through us, through everything we built together." James pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "He would be proud of you, Sarah. Proud of the woman you became, the life you built, the family you raised. He would be proud of us," she corrected. "Because I could not have done any of this without you. You kept your promise, James. You made it worth signing." "Best decision I ever made was promising you that," he said. "Because it meant I got to spend my life proving it to you." They stayed by the creek until late into the night, talking about everything and nothing, remembering the journey that had brought them from that dusty office where a young woman with shaking hands had signed away her past, and a cowboy had promised her a future. As they rode back to the ranch house in the moonlight, Sarah looked at the land stretching out around them, land they owned, land they had worked and bled for, land they would pass on to their children and grandchildren. And she thought about that terrified young woman she had been, sitting in that office, sure that her life was over. She had been so wrong. Her life had not been ending that day, it had been beginning, and what a beautiful life it had been. Years continued to flow like the creek by the cottonwood grove, steady and sure. In 1910, James and Sarah celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren, a boisterous gathering that filled the main house to bursting. Daniel, now 32 himself and managing much of the daily operations of Crossed Rivers, made a toast to his parents. "To the 2 people who taught us what love looks like," he said, raising his glass. "Who showed us that hard work, integrity, and devotion can build something that lasts. Dad, Mom, everything good in our lives comes from the foundation you built. Thank you." There was not a dry eye in the room as everyone raised their glasses in agreement. James and Sarah looked at each other across the table, their hands clasped together, and in that moment, All the struggles and challenges and hard times faded away, leaving only the undeniable truth. They had built something extraordinary together, not just a ranch or a business, but a family bound by love. In 1915, when Sarah turned 60, Emma organized a celebration that brought friends and family from across Texas. Former clients whose horses Sarah had trained came to pay their respects. Ranch hands who had worked for them over the decades came to share stories and memories. The governor of Texas even sent a letter acknowledging Sarah's contributions to the state's horse breeding industry. But the moment Sarah treasured most from that day was when James took her hand and led her away from the crowd, out to the porch of the main house where it had all really begun, on the porch of her little cabin where he had first told her he loved her. 60 years old, he said, smiling at her. Hard to believe that young woman with the shaking hands has become this amazing woman standing before me. I had a good teacher, she replied, touching his face. His hair was completely silver now, and there were deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but his storm-cloud eyes were just as clear and steady as they had been that first day. You taught me how to hope again, how to dream again, how to love. We taught each other, he said, pulling her close. And we are not done yet. We still have years ahead of us, Sarah. Years to watch our grandchildren grow, to keep building on what we started. Years to sit on this porch and watch sunsets. Promise. She asked, and he heard the echo of a younger Sarah in that word, the scared girl who had needed promises to hold on to. Promise, he said firmly. For as long as God gives us, I will be right here beside you. He kept that promise. Through the trials of World War I, when Joseph enlisted despite his parents' fears and came home safe but changed. Through the influenza epidemic of 1918 that swept through Texas and took so many lives, though mercifully spared the Hartley family. Through the drought of 1920 that tested the ranch's resources and resilience. Through all of it, James and Sarah stood together, weathering each storm as they had weathered all the others, with faith, determination, and an unshakable commitment to each other. In 1925, they celebrated their 47th anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. Their children had offered to throw a party, but James and Sarah had declined, preferring to spend the evening as they had spent so many others, together, in the peaceful quiet of their own company. They sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set just as they had done thousands of times before. Sarah was 70 now, her brown hair silver, her face lined with age, but James still thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. James was 72, moving a bit slower than he once had, but still strong, still vital, still the rock Sarah leaned on. 47 years, Sarah said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. Best 47 years of my life, James replied, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. Every single day, even the hard ones. Do you ever think about that day in the office? When I signed the papers, sometimes, I think about how close we came to never meeting. If Thompson had sent someone else to handle the sale, if you had decided to fight the bank instead of selling, if 1,000 different things had gone differently. But they did not. Somehow, against all odds, we found each other. You found me, Sarah corrected. I was lost, and you found me and gave me a reason to hope again. We found each other, James said, squeezing her hand. Two broken people who fit together perfectly and made each other whole. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to orange to deep purple. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing, horses nickering, the familiar sounds of the ranch that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Somewhere in the house behind them, they knew their grandson James was working on the books, preparing to take over more of the ranch management as his grandfather slowed down. Their legacy was secure, their work would continue, the life they had built together would endure long after they were gone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah leaned her head on James's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They had been sitting exactly like this in this exact position for nearly 50 years, and it still felt as right and perfect as it had the very first time. "Thank you," Sarah whispered into the gathering darkness. "For what? For keeping your promise. For making it worth signing. For giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams. For loving me." James turned and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her, soap and sunshine and home. "Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but a promise and a hope. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for loving me back. Always," she promised, "for as long as God gives us and beyond that." "Always," he echoed, and in that simple word was a lifetime of love, commitment, devotion, and partnership. They sat together on the porch as night fell over Crossed Rivers Ranch. Two people who had started with nothing but hope and shaking hands on a contract, and had built an empire of love that would last for generations. The papers Sarah had signed all those years ago had seemed like an ending, but they had been a beginning, the beginning of the greatest love story either of them could have imagined. And as they sat there together, surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had raised, and the legacy they would leave behind, they knew with absolute certainty that every moment, every struggle, every triumph had been worth it. The cowboy had kept his promise, and together, they had made it all worthwhile. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and eternal as they had for all the years of their marriage and would for years to come. And on the porch of the ranch house they had built together, James and Sarah Hartley held hands and watched the night sky, grateful for every moment they had been given, every day they had shared, every year of the extraordinary life they had created from shaking hands, a signature, and a cowboy's promise that he would make it all worth signing. And he had, oh, how gloriously he had.